So, for today's review, I'll be looking at a movie that's definitely a classic noir, but which takes a different tone from the usual gangster film. The movie's title is The Asphalt Jungle, and it was released in 1950. The story about the story. I usually don't talk about the politics of Hollywood because usually they don't matter. A good story is a good story, and stories that tell you what to think, regardless of their motivations or conclusions, aren't good stories. But this time it's worth bringing it up because in 1950, the director, John Huston, was getting very political. Following World War II, America didn't pivot towards anti-communism so much as we returned to it. The first Red Scare took place just after the Bolsheviks won in Russia, after all. And while the USSR was our ally of convenience during the war, pretty much everybody on both sides knew what would happen once the fascist threat was eliminated. In fact, HUAC, the House of Un-American Activities Committee, first came into being in 1938. Its precursors date back to 1918, and it became a permanent House committee in 1945. In July of 46, Billy Wilkerson started publishing names of supposed communists and communist sympathizers in his newspaper, The Hollywood Reporter. According to an article later published by his son, Wilkerson did this less out of patriotism or love of capitalism, and more out of revenge for his decades-old failed attempt to create his own studio. However, HUAC took his list seriously, and it called many of the people named to congressional hearings to speak about the supposed spread of communist ideas in Hollywood films. Some of the famous names that appeared before the committee were just as concerned as HUAC, names like Walt Disney, Ayn Rand, and Ronald Reagan. Others, however, protested the growing witch hunt, and this second group included Humphrey Bogart, Lauren Bacall, Billy Wilder, and John Huston. But at the center of this controversy was the Hollywood 10, group of mostly screenwriters who were brought before Congress to answer allegations that they were members of the Communist Party and inserting communist propaganda into their films. Many of them were communists, by the way, but even at that point, being a communist wasn't a crime. The Hollywood 10 were the 10 witnesses who refused to testify at all, citing their First Amendment rights, and they were held in contempt of Congress. Following the hearings, the president of the MPAA, Eric Johnson, stated that he would see to it that the Hollywood 10 would be fired and not re-employed until they swore they weren't communists and agreed to work with HUAC. And that was the start of the Hollywood blacklist, a list that would ruin hundreds of people's lives for the next 15 years. By the way, do you know how the blacklist ended? Two big reasons. First, TV stations started ignoring the list and broke the monopoly. Second, a man named John Henry Falk sued the blacklisters and won, which meant that they were now liable for the loss of income that comes with blacklisting. So what's all this to do with the Asphalt Jungle? Well, in the first place, HUAC protests were how John Huston met the movie's future lead actor, Sterling Hayden. During World War II, Hayden left a growing Hollywood career to join the military, and he wound up becoming an officer of the OSS, the precursor to the CIA. He infiltrated what was then fascist Yugoslavia, and he became a communist sympathizer after spending time with the local resistance fighters. He wouldn't end up on the blacklist later because he caved in to HUAC and named names, a decision he would later regard with contempt, even though the names he gave were already known to the committee. John Huston, meanwhile, would move to Ireland in 1952 and spent most of the rest of his life there. But the other reason I believe The Asphalt Jungle has something to do with politics is because of the way it humanizes the criminal protagonists. In most movies about gangsters and career criminals, including all the ones I've covered in this series, the gangsters are completely amoral, with no compunctions about killing and no respect for family values or lawful businesses. But as you'll soon find out, that's not going to be the case this time. The story. The movie begins with a tall guy evading the cops, eventually ducking into a grimy brick cafe. As soon as he's inside, he hands his revolver to the man behind the counter, who hides it in his cash register without a word. The cops aren't far behind, and although they ask the restaurant owner, Gus, to cooperate, he tells them to get a search warrant or to get out. So they arrest the tall man and leave. The man is put in a police lineup, and we learn his name. William Dix Handley, age 36, born in Kentucky. It's obvious that the officer in charge, Lieutenant Dietrich, wants him for armed robbery, but for whatever reason, the man who was robbed refuses to identify Dix. Commissioner Hardy calls Lieutenant Dietrich up to his office and starts chewing him out for the record crime levels in his precinct, and for all the bookies he's let slide. Hardy wants Dietrich to get all police brutality if he has to, and he asks about Doc Erwin Riedenschneider, a career felon who recently got out on parole and then lost the police tail who were trying to follow him. In the end, the commissioner gives Dietrich one last chance to pull his weight. That evening, Doc Riedenschneider takes a cab to Cobby's place, Cobby being one of those bookies in the 4th Precinct. Cobby doesn't recognize Doc on sight, but he knows his reputation and welcomes him in. Doc has a proposition, a big caper worth $500,000. To do it, he needs a $50,000 investment. And although that's too much for Cobby, Doc's come to him because he's heard Cobby can put him in contact with a Mr. Emmerich. Excited by the payout, Cobby immediately goes to make the call. Right as he gets back, Dix comes in and makes a $2,300 bet. Cobby says his credit's good for $2,500, but Dix takes it as an insult and says he'll go out and get the $2,300 right away. We head back to the diner where Gus, who has a bit of a hunchback, is feeding a cat. Some random dude insults his cat, insults him, and refuses to buy anything, so Gus runs him out. Gus tells Dix to lay low, stop robbing places, but Dix can't afford to, especially not with his expensive new bet. Against his better judgment, Gus agrees to lend Dix the money, and he mentions that the police raided the Club Regal recently, which is where Doll works. After Dix leaves, Gus calls a man with a wife and baby sleeping in the back room, and although he refuses to lend an extra $1,300 at first because of his family, he eventually agrees. After Dix gets back home, Doll shows up with a briefcase and a fake smile. She tries to keep her cool, but then she breaks down in tears. When the Regal got raided, it was just before she was going to get paid, and she got locked out of her room in the process. She asks Dix to stay a few days, and Dix agrees. Meanwhile, Doc and Cobby have gone to discuss the caper with Emmerich at his second home. During the conversation, Emmerich mentions that he's a defense lawyer for criminals, which explains why he'd have the contacts and the money for this endeavor. Doc needs 3 things from him: money for the operation, personnel, and a way to dispose of the take. First, they need a boxman, a safecracker, and Cobby suggests Louis Civelli, an expert mechanic. Next, they need a driver, and finally, a hooligan. Paying for their services, by the way, is where that $50,000 comes in. They'll also need a fence, maybe 2 or 3, but Emmerich offers to do that bit himself. He knows some highly respectable potential buyers in the area. It's smiles and handshakes all around. Doc mentions that he plans to retire to Mexico afterwards and chase the Mexican girls all day long. Once they leave, Emmerich goes to speak to his holy shit, that's Marilyn Monroe. Seriously, her first significant role was playing Angela Finlay, Emmerich's mistress. Anyway, once she's gone to bed, Emmerich calls a man named Bob Branham and tells him to go and collect some debts. The next morning, Gus calls Dix to say he's got the money for the bet. Doll mentions that Dix was talking in his sleep, and it gets him reminiscing about his early days back on his Kentucky farm. Unfortunately, he lost the farm after a series of troubles, and ever since, he's dreamed of one day buying it back. Dix brings the money over to Cobby's just as Doc stops by again. Doc seems mildly impressed by Dix, but Cobby dismisses it. Once he's gone, Doc talks about the talkative prostitute Cobby apparently set him up with last night. Turns out she knows that Emmerich is secretly broke, but Cobby doesn't believe it. Suddenly, Lieutenant Diedrich shows up and sees the two of them together. The lieutenant promises to stay quiet about Doc since he's not supposed to be there either, but he does tell Cobby that he'll have to raid him to keep his boss happy. Of course, this is some really bad timing, so Cobby slips Diedrich a bribe, and the lieutenant tells him to go dark for a few nights. Branham, the private detective, goes to see Emmerich and has bad news. He couldn't get any of his creditors to pay. Emmerich almost breaks down when he hears this, confirming his financial problems, and he decides to let Branham in on his scheme. He plans to rip off the other guys by taking the jewels and promising the money later, and then leaving the country in a plane. Branham says he'll tell him how to raise the capital for half the take, and when Emmerich agrees, he says Cobby can forward the cash. It's just a matter of how to approach him, to make him feel big. Back at Cobby's, Doc interviews Louis and decides he's right for the job. Incidentally, Louis is that family man who loaned the $1,300. The next step is to find a driver, and Louis says there's only one man for the job, Gus, the diner owner. Doc suggests Dix for the hooligan, and so they have their tea. Doll has found a new place to live, and Dix gets her address as she leaves. He then gets a call to join the planning session. Once it's over, Doc brings Dix into his confidence. He doesn't trust Emmerich, and he wants Dix to have his back in case things go sour. The caper begins, and at first it goes like clockwork. Louis heads into the sewer and breaks through a weak brick wall to enter the jewelry store's basement. He lets Doc and Dix in through the back door, and together they sneak past an early infrared security beam and blow open the vault with a homemade explosive. Unfortunately, the shockwave sets off an alarm across the street, and the police start showing up and looking around. They manage to steal all the most valuable items, but as they're leaving, they knock out a night watchman and his gun goes off and hits Louis in the upper thigh. They manage to get away through the sewers, but Louis isn't looking good, and they can't bring him to the hospital. Dix and Doc head to Emmerich's place to make the exchange, but of course Emmerich tries to renege, and Doc is having none of that. When negotiations fail, Branham pulls his gun. He trades shots with Dix and Dix wins, although he also gets winged in the side. He prepares to kill Emmerich next, but Doc stops him, saying it would be too easy. Instead, he tells Emmerich to contact the jeweler's insurance company and set up a ransom. Doc also leaves him to clean up Branham's corpse, which he does by tossing it off a bridge. Doc and Dix go to lay low at Cobby's place, and Dix pointedly refuses to have a doctor look at his wound, saying he doesn't trust them. Gus calls, saying the police have set up a dragnet, and to go to his friend Eddie Donato's neighborhood since the cops never go there. And just as soon as Gus is done, the police pick him up. Things are looking alright the next morning. The insurance people say they're willing to play ball, and when the police come to question Emmerich about Branham's body, he tells them he was with his mistress, and then calls her to tell her what story to give to the cops. When he gets back to his wife, who complains about those awful criminals he works with, Emmerich delivers a speech directly into the camera. Oh, there's nothing so different about them. After all, crime is only a left-handed form of human endeavor. Back with Dix and Doc, their host, Eddie, is getting uncomfortable with all the heat, and so they leave for Doll's new apartment. On their way over, they get stopped by a patrol cop who recognizes Doc from his picture in the newspaper. They knock him out, but Doc gets clobbered. Meanwhile, the cab driver who delivered Doc to Cobby's place tips off the cops. As a result, Lieutenant Diedrich has to bring Cobby in. He gets a little rough with him in the process, and pretty much immediately, Cobby gives in and spills his guts. Emmerich is planning a long trip to Cuba, which is kind of funny in retrospect, but then Commissioner Hardy shows up to take him away. Emmerich reads Cobby's confession and calmly watches as the commissioner breaks Angela's alibi statement. He then calmly goes to the next room, writes most of a suicide note before tearing it up, and then pulls a gun from the desk drawer and shoots himself. This, by the way, is the thing that the censors took exception to, since they thought it meant Emmerich was evading justice. Meanwhile, down at the county jail, Gus tries to strangle Cobby through the cell bars. Just a little while later, 3 armed officers break into what turns out to be Louie's funeral. Everything's falling apart, but Doc and Dix are still hoping they can get out of the state before the heat finds them. Doc has sewed the jewels into the lining of his coat, and Dix is planning to head back to Kentucky with the advance he got for the job. Doc gets lucky and climbs into a taxi with a fellow German immigrant for a driver, and he talks him into driving straight to Cleveland. Back at the apartment, Dix's wound is getting worse. He wants to drive straight to Kentucky, a 10-hour trip, but he's in no shape to do it. Dahl insists on driving for him. After a few objections, he relents. Doc and the taxi driver stop at a diner at the edge of town. Doc winds up spending a little extra time there so he can watch a young lady dance to some music. This turns out to be just long enough for some police officers to spot him through the window. And when they check Doc out, they notice the rocks in his coat. He even calls attention to the irony of the timing when they take him away. Somewhere out in the country, Dix faints from blood loss during a train stop, and Dahl takes him to the nearest doctor. The doctor starts him on a plasma transfusion, but he also calls the police when he notices the gunshot wound. The transfusion is enough to revive Dix, and so he immediately pulls out the IV, staggers back to the car with Dahl trailing him, and drives off. We get a short interlude with the commissioner that's basically there to make up for the crooked cop character, but at the same time, his hard-on-crime attitude is undercut when he talks about Dix being a hardened killer without any human feelings or mercy. Specifically, he's undercut when we go back to Dix and Dahl, driving through a Kentucky morning, and Dix is going on a delusional rant about the horses he had on his old farm. He manages to reach the property, and halfway to the farmhouse, he collapses for the last time. And that's the end. The analysis. So, why do people watch tragedies? I bring this up now because, while we've had sad and bittersweet endings before, The Asphalt Jungle is easily the most classically tragic film I've covered. And what's more, I feel like this would have been a tragedy even without the production code dictating the plot. Commissioner Hardy seems like a backhanded way of insulting the hard-line war on crime attitude by showing that he's really not a better person than all the lawbreakers around him. But aside from that, the tragedy fit the story perfectly. So why do we watch them? Back when I asked that same question about the horror genre, I framed the answer in economic terms. If people didn't want to see tragedies, why would they fork over hard-earned cash to see them? But while the basis for that is easy enough to figure out for horror because we want to feel the excitement of fear, it's a bit harder to lay it out for tragedy. Hell, philosophers have debated this question for millennia. Plato couldn't really see the point of tragedy, nor the point of following unethical protagonists, which is why in The Republic, he proposed censoring the lot of them in favor of happy stories about upstanding heroes who could be role models. If that sounds familiar, it's because this same idea would go on to define international censorship throughout the first half of the 20th century. In his response to Plato's thoughts, Aristotle came up with a concept he called catharsis. To him, a tragedy calls up the dark emotions of pity, despair, and grief in order to release them safely, to allow the audience to purge these feelings so that they won't get in the way of worthier endeavors. A more modern psychological interpretation of catharsis refers to the emotional dam, the wall people sometimes place between their grief and themselves, which can sometimes break down under the right stimulus. This breakdown would be the catharsis. Another school of thought relates to Schadenfreude, that amazing German word that means joy at another person's pain. While that best applies to dark comedy and slapstick, for some folks, going to see a tragedy means going to experience the thought, "There, but for the grace of God, go I." It's not that you're laughing at a funeral, just feeling better about your life, because now it doesn't suck so much by comparison. So where's the truth? Probably in a little bit of everything. Schadenfreude and the original meaning of catharsis point out that tragic stories offer the audience a sense of perspective, the understanding that our lives could have been so much worse, and we could have struggled through them even so. It gives us the strength to fight on even in the face of losing everything. To take the psychological approach, experiencing a tragedy vicariously allows us to experience our negative emotions and to understand them. This practice with our pain and grief lets us get through our real tragedies more easily when they inevitably happen. And tragedy also lets us do what John Huston wanted to do when he chose to direct the Asphalt Jungle. It allows us to identify with people we might otherwise have dismissed or hated, and it brings us around to commiserating with them instead. Commissioner Hardy is a hard-ass from start to finish, and while he's got good points at both ends of the movie, on other points he's objectively wrong, at least from what the rest of the movie shows us. Now, the Asphalt Jungle doesn't try to ram this message down your throat. It's not as single-minded as Intolerance, and you can take a different message away. But to me, at least, the attempt at tragic empathy was clearly made. Thanks for joining me again for today's film review. I'm going to be doing a little shuffling around for the next video, and as such, I hope you'll join me next time for a period piece about Howard Hughes, English Nazis, and a comic book hero.